Thank you, John. On behalf of the Greek Politics Specialist Group, I would like to welcome everyone to this second year of webinars co-organized by our group and the British School at Athens. And for those of you who don't know us, we are a group of academics and researchers specializing on Greek politics. Our group exists since 2004. It is the official specialist group of the Political Studies Association. It has over 400 members and hence is currently the largest community of political scientists on Greek politics abroad. So what we do is that we organize various activities and seminars in order to foster research and dialogue within and beyond the academic community. And we build the synergies with other scientific associations, and we aspire to have an impact in the public sphere via a vibrant presence in the media. You can find more information on the group via our website, and those of you who are interested to make part of our community, please register in the GPSG, given the fact that we can only be funded via our member subscriptions. Your registrations are multiply important for us. So we are very excited today to inaugurate the second year of the webinars with a book presentation. The book is entitled The Greek Military Dictatorship, Revisiting a Troubled Past, 1967-1974, an important topic and of interest to historians and political scientists. And we're even happier to have with us both book editors and writers, Katerina Lagos and Othon Anastasakis. Katerina Lagos is a professor of history at California State University, Sacramento, and the director of the Hellenic Studies Program and the Hellenic Studies Center. She's adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, the Social Sciences Book Review Editor for the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, and also a member of various academic and professional organizations. She received her DPhil from St. Antony's College, Oxford, in modern history. Her research focuses on the Metaxas dictatorship, minorities, and the interwar period. She has published a number of articles and the book chapters on those topics, and she's currently working on another book manuscript on the Metaxas dictatorship and Greek Jewry, 1936-1941, which is forthcoming at Palgrave. Othon Anastasakis is the director of the Southeast European Studies at Oxford. He is a senior research fellow at St. Antony's College, associate at the Department of Politics and International Relations in Oxford, affiliate of the Center for International Studies and of the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies. And he's also former director of the European Studies Center also at St. Antony's College at Oxford University. He teaches Southeast European politics and European integration and EU politics, and he's currently the principal investigator of two research projects, Greek Diaspora Project at CISOX and Migration Diplomacy and Turkey-EU Relations. He's also an adjunct professor at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, and region head of Oxford Analytica for Europe. He received a BA in economics from the University of Athens, his MA in comparative politics and international relations from Columbia University at New York, and his PhD in comparative government from the LSE. He holds additional degrees in French literature and politics from Paris 4, and in Spanish literature, history and history of art from the Universidad Internacional Menderes Pelayo. And then the book will be discussed by Professor Konstantina Botsiou and Eirini Karamouzi. Konstantina Botsiou studied history archaeology at the University of Athens and holds a PhD from the University of Tübingen. Until 2021, she has been associate professor and director of the Center for Greek and International History at the Department of Political Science and International Relations of the University of Peloponnese, where she also served as vice rector for quality assurance. She is a visiting professor at the Hellenic National Defense College and general director of the Council for International Relations Greece. She's also main instructor for American history in the Master of Science in American Studies of the University of Piraeus. Her books include Greece's course to Europe, Europe between NATO and the EEC, the Balkans in the Cold War, and 1821 from the revolution to state formation. Dr. Botsiou has recently been elected as professor at the University of Piraeus. Finally, Eirini Karamouzi, she is a senior lecturer in contemporary history at the University of Sheffield. She is the author of Greece, the EEC and Cold War 1974-1979, The Second Enlargement, and she is the co-editor of the volume Balkans in the Cold War. She's also co-editor of Contemporary European History and Cold War History Journal. She has published extensively on the history of European integration, Cold War, modern Greece, and the Southern European peace movements. Her current research focuses on Olympic Airways in promoting Greece to the world. So now the floor is to the editors of the book, and I believe author Katerina will start.
Good morning from Sacramento. Kalispera σας. Thank you very much to John, Eirini, and Lamprini for organizing and hosting this wonderful discussion of our book, and thank you to Konstantina for willing to serve as discussant. The Greek military dictatorship, revisiting a troubled past, was an idea that arose at the end of a conference that I organized in Sacramento over a sunny April weekend in 2017 on the 50th anniversary of the imposition of military rule in Greece. Listening to the presentations, Othman and I noticed two things. First, that 50 years after the colonel's coup, many aspects of the dictatorship remained understudied, and there was space for more research on this contested period of Greece's recent Cold War history. Second, despite the 50 years distance, some legacies of the regime are still with us today. We therefore took the decision to build on this conference by inviting some of our paper presenters to contribute to a volume and to solicit some additional contributions aiming at an innovative and up-to-date addition to the literature on the military regime. While military dictatorships were a clear aberration in the political life of Greece, the junta dictatorship exhibits examples of exceptionalism as well as instances of continuity, meaning where the military rulers did not change course in the internal and external relations of the regime. We asked our contributors to address this important point of rupture and continuity in the respective chapters. The links between civilian and military elites goes back well into the 19th century. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Greek army established itself as an active participant in the political affairs of the country. During the post-World War II period, the Greek army was homogeneous in political orientation and saw itself as protector of the country from the threat of communism during the period of the Cold War. It is not a surprise to know that there were 4 coups d'etats planned, but not executed, between 1950 and 1967. What made the 1967 coup different from the past was the success of the coup and the longevity of the dictatorship. It is a paradox, and unlike Latin American counterparts, the colonels came to power during a period of general economic growth, not stagnation, and in response to political crisis and social mobilization. Once in power, the colonels charted a varied course of reactionary politics and populist rhetoric. This is where our book contributes to the existing literature of the field. We explore how and why the regime was able to maintain power for nearly 7 years, much longer than any dictatorship in Greek history. To begin with our themes of rupture and continuity, the dictatorship's rupture with the past can be clearly seen in the fields of education, culture, and church affairs. Our contributors address these topics in the book section on the internal affairs of the regime. In education, the colonels immediately overturned the 1964 Education Act of the George Papandreou administration, and a new reactionary scheme was introduced that even included making Katharevousa the official language of the state in 1968. Accompanying the educational changes, the colonels created lists of banned books to be stricken from course lists, and bookshops and national cultural figures such as Cavafy were appropriated and repurposed to serve the ideological goals of the regime. In regards to the Orthodox Church, intervention in ecclesiastical affairs was not an unknown phenomenon in Greek history. Metaxas overturned the archiepiscopal elections of 1938, but the colonel's brazen removal of Archbishop Chrysostomos in favor of a younger and more pliant Hieronymos marks a dramatic break in church-state relations and led to unprecedented consequences within the Orthodox Church and its administration. Finally, in terms of rupture on an external level, the colonel's initial Greek Cypriot policy differed little from Konstantinos Karamanlis and George Papandreou in their administrations. Soon, however, George Papadopoulos' duplicity in attempting to secure a secret settlement with Turkey based on double enosis was a break from the past. Dimitrios Ioannidis' attempted coup d'etat marks a complete rupture with previous administrations. Not only was the coup a complete disaster, but it brought about the permanent division of the island, and Cypriots today still remember the violence and trauma of the tragic events of that summer. Alternatively, there were examples of continuity from the pre-dictatorial past as well. Economic policy is one such example, and our contributors underscore how the colonels relied on the same institutions and people for their investment priorities. While the colonels expressed a desire to attract foreign companies and foreign direct investments, the same economic elite funneled and shaped investments within the country. The continuity of domestic economic policies helped the regime ride the wave of the quote-unquote Greek miracle that characterized the Greek post-war economy. In addition, Greek workers saw their real wages grow, while cheap mortgages helped boost living standards, and farmers enjoyed expanded welfare coverage and subsidized credits. Only when the OPEC oil crisis of the early 1970s occurred did the winning coalition, using Bruce Bueno de Mesquita's terminology, in the colonel's regime start to unravel. This exacerbated the existing tensions and factions within the leadership and would lead to a dramatic break in November 1973 following the Polytechnio. Externally, issues of continuity were also evident in foreign relations. Our contributors show that despite various European countries paying lip service to human rights and civil liberties, these political values were disregarded in favor of trade relations with the dictatorship. Business as usual, and the profits that this generated proved too lucrative to countries such as England, France, and West Germany to sacrifice at the altar of human rights. These trade relations were justified due to the Cold War tensions and keeping Greece tied to the West. As a result, repeated attempts to implement economic sanctions against the Greek dictatorships were blocked, and individual countries' trade relations resumed as before or were moderately reduced in volume. The United States was in a particularly vexing position, as it was and still is widely believed that it helped impose the dictatorship on the Greeks. Although this is not the case, President Johnson did nothing to prevent the colonels from taking power. Both Johnson and members of his administration spent the rest of his presidency publicly and privately expressing their disapproval of the regime while trying to persuade the colonels to transition to parliamentary rule. Once Richard Nixon was elected, he had no qualms about the nature of the regime and openly embraced the colonels. Not only did he continue to engage in economic trade with the dictators, primarily military, he proudly endorsed the regime as a, quote, model NATO ally. In conclusion, the military dictatorship represents a complex period that deserves renewed investigation. Our arguments regarding rupture and continuity help us take a new look at the nature of the regime within a wider international framework. Returning to de Mesquita's terminology, we conclude that the colonel's winning coalition of domestic groups and foreign countries help us understand how this troubling and reactionary dictatorship maintained power for so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Katerina. Othman, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lamprini, and it is a wonderful pleasure to do our formal book launch with you, and thank also Eirini and Konstantina for being discussants, and John Bennett for hosting us. It is a real pleasure for us. Now, Katerina, with whom we worked together with our contributors for 3.5 years, this book, for which we're really, really happy because there's a lot of rich information in there. She did present some of the themes and some of the arguments that go throughout the book. I will continue from where Katerina left it by focusing on the revisiting a troubled past part of our title, and by focusing on two main issues, the two legs, as I call it, the legitimacy or legitimation and the legacy. Now, Katerina pointed to the longevity of the regime, the 7-year rule, and that for Southern European standards, compared with Spain and Portugal, it's not that long. But bearing in mind that the military rulers lacked any visible proactive support to sustain their authority, obviously 7 years is no mean feat. So when they came to power, they didn't have the support of the political class from left to right. They were internally divided. That was a middle rank officers that took over, so they didn't have the support of the generals. They lacked the support of the monarchy, and they themselves as well. They were divided between hardliners and softliners. So how did they seek legitimation in order to be able to sustain themselves for 7 years? Every chapter in this book deals in its own kind of way and its own kind of focus on some issues on why the regimes managed to sustain this kind of viability. Now, one of the first thing is ideological legitimation. This is a very basic kind of legitimation that all authoritarian regimes try when they're in power. Juan Lins makes this kind of distinction between totalitarian regimes and authoritarian regimes. The first ones, they use ideology a lot because they have this kind of total control of power, the total control of ideas, the total control of society. The authoritarian regimes, which are regimes of more limited pluralism, they try to use ideas, but more often than not, it's about their mentalities. They don't have those coherent, consistent ideological frameworks. And that's mostly what we see in this military regime. Katerina did her chapter on the background and the ideology of the junta. I did it on education, and that is something that we really see in terms of how you've got the military mind, an ideology that almost treats the kitsch and a totally disconnected kind of discourse. The second source of legitimacy was the creation of networks of opportunists, informants, sympathizers, clientelistic appointments. We saw that very clearly in the educational apparatus. We saw that in the church. Not only did Papadopoulos remove the previous and he installed his own archbishop, Ioannidis did the same by removing Papadopoulos archbishop and bringing his own in power. That was very clearly a way that they wanted to control. The third pillar of legitimation was the economic performance. Katerina did say on this. There's a very good chapter by Kakridis there, who speaks about how the junta used cheap lending, construction, anti-parochi, tourism, hotel business, and also allying itself with a narrow circle of businesses and shipping capital. Paradoxically, despite the rhetoric on foreign investment, and in particular American foreign investment, Kalogeratos in a very good chapter showed that these areas actually, from American investment, didn't succeed as they were expecting, and soon they were abandoned or were not materialized. And the fourth pillar of legitimation is that of external support. That support can take the form of ambivalence towards the regime. Indeed, Alex Kitroev has a very good chapter on the Greek American diaspora and the Archbishop of the Greek American Diocese, where at the beginning they had a kind of a mixed reaction, even wanting to organize a big conference in Athens, and only gradually removing their support. or the business as usual, like Nafpliotis in his chapter on the UK, both Conservative Party and Labour Party, they were willing to cooperate practically with the regime, or other European states, despite the voices in parliament that were against, obviously, the regime. So the Cold War environment was the perfect alibi for this international legitimation of the regime. So the regime used all these forms of legitimation. No regime survives merely on repression and control, but it needs to have some kind of sources of legitimation. And even when they attempted in 1973 to civilianize and to pseudo-liberalize their power, they were confronted with a reaction from the student movement, as we know, but then from the internal opposition of the hardliners as well. So the last phase of the dictatorship was the one that there was no more legitimating pillars to sustain it. The networks were divided and weakened. The economy entered into a phase of crisis, as we know, and stagflation and depression. The external support waned and disappeared after the debacle in Cyprus. So let me move to the second leg now, which is that of the legacy. Here, when revisiting such traumatic pasts, legacies, usually individual or collective, they are important reference to historical periods or historical moments. So the end of the junta, as we know, did not have any winners. It left a legacy of a mixture of guilt and repulsion. Most of the mainstream political class of the right and center-right felt some form of responsibility for its role during the final stages before the imposition of the military rule. The crown paid the price. It was totally removed from the political life of Greece. The military as an institution was discredited, suffered a heavy defeat. So the discrediting of this military regime, it led to a number of significant long-term developments in the sense of the ending of the official anti-communist state, the position of the military under civilian rule, the end of the monarchy, the consolidation of democratic generation, the development of a more inclusive two-party system, the consolidation of anti-Americanism. These were all the legacies of this kind of 7-year rule, as it were. But there were also the actual moments as well. The legacies of the moments. And the Polytechnic uprising, for instance, it was very particular in terms of its own legacy. We know that it saw the creation of a new generation, which dominated subsequent political developments, but also introduced new forms of ideological battles, where the role of women was more assertive, where the role of educated and enlightened professionals, the politicized nature of university life, and even the radicalization of the urban sectors with November 17, appropriating the memory of the student uprising. And the other important moment, the 1974 moment, has a very ambivalent legacy in the sense that they can never be celebrated unequivocally, because it was based on the one hand on a military defeat, and on the other hand, it was based which was the legacy of Cyprus, and on the other hand, obviously, it was based on the collapse of authoritarian rule and the start of democracy. But that's a very divided legacy and very ambivalent. So what we can say for that moment, though, it was that this was the moment of real rupture with the past, a threshold event of discontinuity with the status quo ante. A year of radical change in the history of modern Greece, and a clean break with the post-Second World War past. In some ways, and I don't know whether our Cold War historians agree with me on this, the fall of the junta and the post-1974 period actually put Greece into the end of the Cold War era much earlier than all the other countries in the European continent. It went into the European integration. It ended it legitimized the Communist Party. It saw the smooth accession of the Socialist Party in power, cordial relations with the Balkan states, but also the new enemy coming from the East. And with that, I would like to end here. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Othon. And now we can pass to the discussion. So, Konstantina, the floor is yours, and then Eirini will comment.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, part of this panel. I would like to thank Lamprini, Eirini, and John for inviting me, and Othon and Katerina for having me here to present their book and discuss their book. I'll start right away because I don't have enough time. I think that this is a very important book about the dictatorship. It's very refreshing that the two editors have taken up this topic in a year of the bicentennial of 1821. And it's a part actually of our thinking about what Greece has achieved in those 2 centuries until today. I think the editors and the other authors have produced a very impressive book that encapsulates new, refreshing archival research into less familiar chapters. And at the same time, it helps us clarify existing data about the dictatorship. Othon has talked about the 13 authors that have worked on this volume for a long period of time. And this shows in the book, as it is going beyond what we know and depicts the dictatorship not only as an anachronism of both Greek and Western politics, but also as an aspect of Greek political identity, actually as an accident that was waiting to happen. Othon talked about the guilt of right and center-right politicians for what had happened before the dictatorship. Now, the main impression that was left to me by reading this book is that the regime sought intentionally specific continuities and discontinuities. Continuity was promoted firmly in the realm of economic policies, at least until 1973, when the oil crisis erupted. And we see here a convincing argument brought about by Andreas Kakridis and Nikolas Kalogerakos. The same applies to foreign policy. The Cyprus issue remained central, and the kernels were fixed on the idea of delivering the island's enosis with Greece to succeed where others had failed before them, a point that is being underlined by Yannis Akas. Regarding relations with the Western countries, such as Britain, West Germany, and the United States, the regime followed again path-dependent trajectories. As James Miller, Morgan Spelt, and Alexandros Navpliotis show, continuity was a problem for those states, actually, as they were trying to avoid a too close identification with the regime while averting an embarrassing internal rift in the Western alliance. Again, the Cold War impact was there. Thus, in economic and foreign policy, the dictators simply sought to prove themselves better achievers than the political system they had toppled. As all authoritarian regimes, they traded growth for legitimacy. That is, they sought to keep everybody happy with economic growth, with various incentives, in order to silence the opposition, whatever was left of it anyway, and prove that economic prosperity is more important than political prosperity, namely democracy. We can see similar phenomena some other places today. Now, let's move to the pillar of discontinuity. Discontinuity was chiefly visible on the ideological level. Othon Anastasakis explains how education was targeted as an ideology-producing field. Foteini Dimitrouli indicates the manipulative effect of literature through Kavafis's misinterpretation by the regime. Alexander Kitroev, Charalambos Andreopoulos, and Athanasios Gramenos focus on the control of the church as a means of public influence. And the ideological and political profile of the colonels in general is eloquently presented by the late Andrei Gerolimatos and Katerina Lagos. To be sure, the junta aimed to keep Greece in the zeitgeist of monolithic anti-communism, which was then in decline under the impact of international détente. It was being replaced by more sophisticated tools of anti-communism, such as Ostpolitik, democratization, human rights activism, ideas that actually threatened to make the mission of the armed forces redundant. So the killers rushed to protect Ethnikofrosini, which is described in the book as a mix of the local creed of anti-communism and nationalism. The colonels did what they did in the name of the West, but above all in the name of the nation. the defense of Cyprus against external and internal enemies like Makarios or Andreas Papandreou was instrumental in that argumentation. They believed that Cyprus and Greece's Western orientation as well was in danger because persons like Makarios and Andreas Papandreou tolerated leftist anti-Western activism. It wasn't anymore the agenda of the left as in the 1958 elections. Now, success in the Cyprus issue was also a duty the regime owed to the prototype, which the book rightly identifies with the Metaxas dictatorship. Still, we need to connect the dictatorship with the civil war, which is the elephant in the room of Greek 20th century history. The armed forces symbolized the victorious anti-communist forces of the civil war, and they were the ultimate resort of the anti-communist post-civil war state. So they reflected the long-term tradition of military interventionism in Greek politics in the 20th century as a whole. They were the technocrats of the several vital national wars, but the armed forces were also representing the needs of modern Greece as a security provider to the West. Actually, the Greek state used the armed forces in order to get more financial assistance from the West throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, so after the civil war had ended. Therefore, the officers believed that they knew better and that it staged the coup in order to make Greece a favor, to do Greece a favor. They had no problem breaking the sacrosanct military hierarchy in order to save the nation from decay, which only they could see. Developments proved that the regime could not arrest change. The 1973 oil and economic crisis was definitely a game changer in my view, because the regime could no longer trade growth for legitimacy. So the student uprisings in the law school and the Polytechnical School of Athens in 1973 mobilized latent forces of resistance who were losing faith in economic stability. Shortly thereafter, they lost also faith in the regime's international backing and military effectiveness when the Cyprus debacle happened. What the dictatorship actually succeeded politically was that it united all political forces against it. They had learned the lesson from World War II and the Civil War. By avoiding the regime, they saved their chances for rebuilding the state after the collapse of the junta in the name of national unity. So the regime change of 1974 that we call metapolitevsi entailed a further perfect discontinuity with the junta and the past before 1967, especially on the ideological level. The army, the crown, the civil war, ethnicofrosini, Westernism, anti-communism, they all changed meaning. So in order to close with a reference to the legacy that author Anastasakis mentioned, is that the book edited by Author and Katerina helps us discern the impact of dictatorial policies on that radical break with the past that the metapolitevsi brought to Greek politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Konstantina. Eirini, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. This is really a great book. I'm not going to thank everyone because we're running out of time, and my role today is a little bit to ask questions and hopefully get the audience engaged. And Konstantina really provided a wonderful overview of what the book has to offer. First of all, I want to say that this is a great interdisciplinary approach between two editors, one political scientist, one a historian. So I think it really shows in the way you have conceived the composure and the structure of the book, and I think it's something that to be encouraged as we go forward. And I also think it's remarkable that this book is coming out at the same time that another book came out by Klapsis and other editors on the international dimensions, and also with Papachela's book that just came out, so Skotino Domatio, which is now published in Greek. Hopefully there will be an English translation as well. And I think what is interesting, and while I was reading through the book, and I do the same when I have to teach the Greek dictatorship, is also going through an overview of how the event is covered in the press, how it's discussed nowadays. Because I think what is interesting, especially in the concluding part of the volume, and that's where my first question goes, is how important, and it's not touched upon. You talked about legacies, but my main kind of thought was about the importance of language. And I will explain about that. So junta is being used and reused in the Metapolitefsi in different forms. It has been formulated and reformulated. And I think that's kind of an interest from different strands, from different political, across the political spectrum. It appears and reappears in different shapes and forms. And I don't think there's been a cohesive study to really kind of understand how this term comes about and the different connotations that it brings with it. And I kind of, wondered, what do you think is probably why it's such an emotionally charged term 40 years later, despite the successes? We see it so much during the crisis, but that's not just a phenomenon of the crisis. If you look at the Metapolitefsi years, you see this term at that period hotly debated, but not debated about what went wrong on what worked, much more about the term itself and how it was co-opted in the future from different political actors. So I think it's very interesting for us years later, which definitely lacks the political work, which brings me to the second point. What should historians be doing? This is not just a Greek episode. What we're looking, there's this question of, what is the role of the European historian and political scientist today? We have all of these controversies, this polemic surrounding the legacy of Nazism and Holocaust, and ongoing struggle about Europe's colonial history. But the question is, how can a historian contribute? What is the responsibility in this debate? And I think it's important to start thinking about that aspect as well by just saying, because there are amazing, chapters here. We saw the continuity in economic terms about the lack of support from the international allies. But my question is how we can, in a way, interpret and how we can have a say in the discussion of what's going on, how the historians can really bring in their own research in a way, however, that is transmittable and understandable to the wider public. So that's the second. And my final comment, I was kind of wondering, I'm always surprised that France is celebrated in the post-74 era. France helped us bring us to Europe. We all think about Valéry Giscard d'Estaing almost crying when we signed the Treaty of Accession. But the reality is that France was a horrible ally during the junta. They made much more money than anyone else. They sold military arms, and they actually even took over in West Germany's economic role. So I'm always surprised, and in edited volumes, and I understand the perplexities of it. It's very hard to find authors on all topics, and you've done an outstanding work in bringing, so many different historians and political scientists. But my question is, why do we treat France so gently? Is it because of the post-74 era? It seems that France is never held accountable for what was a very favorable attitude towards the junta. And we tend to focus much more on NATO and the United States. It seems that our capability or our casting of accountability is reserved for specific actors and not for others. But congratulations for your book. It's really a wonderful addition, and it should be taught again and again in all our university courses. And congrats for everything.
Thank you, Eirini. I think I will let the authors respond before we go to the Q&A. So who wants to respond first? Othon? Okay.
Yes, of course. I want to thank both Konstantina and Eirini, and I'm grateful to Konstantina also for presenting the book and the contributors. That's really, really important, that it didn't come from us and it came from you, Konstantina. And also, I noticed that we did agree on many things, on what is the actual perception of those historical moments and about legacy. I found also some very interesting points in Eirini's questions that I would like to address. For instance, she's very right, regarding France, how France is always a country that escapes any kind of criticism. We always assume that France is an ally of Greece. There's always that kind of Greco-French kind of connection. That, I believe, is explained. I mean, a lot of ideals come from that country, from the creation of the modern Greek state. And you know, especially during the junta in particular, I mean, that was also a space where a lot of those who were the junta fighters, they had to go there. So France was a country that did accept those you know, oppositions to the junta. Karamouzi was there as well, and I guess that also kind of made, as you have very rightly worked, Eirini, in your book, it was actually West Germany that was particularly pivotal in the accession of Greece into the European communities. How many people know that? They have to read Eirini's book in order to understand the pivotal role of West Germany, actually. As for the UK, I don't know, it's a country that most probably we Greeks love to hate. We all want to go there for studies, and we like, you know, the soft power of the UK, but at the same time, we definitely like to criticize the UK because we do believe that as an imperial power, it has always been very divisive. So that, you know, about France. I also find very interesting your point about the use of the term junta, and it actually goes beyond our own country. I mean, as fascism is a term that is being used so extensively to denote things that are not fascist at the end of the day, you know, many times, I think that junta, and with the help also of the Latin American examples that were very contemporary, and they also had a very powerful impact in the thinking of our left-wing intellectuals in Greece. The notion of junta became a synonym, actually, of, you know, what others would call fascism. It's actually, you know, the word that really shows authoritarianism, repression, what we really hate. As for the role of historians, I would leave that to Katerina. I know what political scientists have to do about this, but, you know, I'll leave the historian's question to Katerina.
Thank you, Othon. And Katerina?
So for the historians, our goal recently is to place Greece in a wider global context. These events that occur, we are not isolated, we don't occur in a vacuum. So finding these connections, these links for us are very valid, and placing Greece within the context of the Cold War, I think, is a very useful paradigm moving forward. And thinking about legacies, I remember on the first screen, you have Mark Mazauer. One of the interesting legacies and how the junta tainted everything that it touched. And one of those is the commemoration of the Greek War of Independence. So you have the 50 year in 1971, and Mark Mazauer has mentioned this in a prior conference that nobody really wanted to touch this again because the junta did such an extensive celebration. Even here in Sacramento, the junta actually sent a bust of a figure in commemoration, like, thank you, Sacramento. And it was actually a Poseidon, even though Sacramento is inland. We're near the coast. So it shows you kind of the illogical kind of nature of the leaders. But how the junta has managed to taint everything that it has touched. So we always see it as an aberration, as very problematic. So I think this was one of the points that we wanted to address in the book.
Lamprini, could I just respond? And I'm sorry that I jump in, but I thought that I was just reading Michael O'Reilly-Smith's question, and that actually connects to the question that Eirini Karamouzi puts regarding the responsibility of the historians. And what Michael O'Reilly-Smith is asking in his question is, what about the, you know, the people during those years? You know, what about a more bottom-up approach? And that would actually be my question to Eirini Karamouzi, because I know that in her work, she actually has this kind of different perspective, you know, from the society. And that, I think, I wanted to ask you, Eirini, do you think that would be actually a very dangerous thing to get into, to see, you know, what about the ordinary people during these times? If you ask me as a, you know, as a political scientist, I will tell you that apathy was the best kind of, you know, instrument for the legitimation of the junta. That's all they wanted, demobilization and apathy. And that's how they, you know, succeeded in keeping themselves in power. But what about an historian? How can an historian get into these kinds of difficult questions?
I mean, Dina can also pitch into that, but I mean, the pivotal work on kind of bottom-up approach would probably be Kornetis and the Children of Dictatorship, where he actually did not look to ordinary men, though, looked at the kind of the resistant clusters that were that led the Polytechnic events. But I think recently, and then there's Papadogian's book that looks at the post-74, sections of how they were trying to resurrect themselves after the junta. I mean, the thing is that it's very hard, first of all, to actually conduct as research, because even the works that have looked at the limited forms of resistance has been based on oral history testimonies, which actually are extremely helpful in understanding where these people were coming from and how they decided to mobilize and what they were trying to achieve. But again, is a very limited sample. The truth of the fact is that the majority of the people did not react. As Kakridis very well documents, the quality of life was not bad. Actually, it was improved. This idea of redistribution policies, it was not something that Karamouzi had to pick up. The problem was that the society was running out of steam. You had the creation of a middle class that wanted more quality of life, wanted more money to spend on consumables, and that was something that the junta caught very early on, and then Karamouzi had to, in a way, implement if he wanted to streamline a smoother democratization process. So I think this is a very difficult part, and I think it's very evocative when, like Stathis Kalivas wrote this article in Kathimerini, where it caused fierce reactions, where he said that, a lot of people did not care about what was going on, and I think it's very hard to swallow that as part of our consciousness as a nation. But I think it is important. The problem is always because I think there was such an anathema to look at this period. We only focused on 73 and we lost part of that research. I think ethnographic approach can be fantastic in getting a sense what was happening in the periphery, what was happening in the villages. That has not happened that much, at least to my knowledge. I'm sure that Dina and Katerina want to pitch in as well.
Can I say something? I think you really hit on an important point, and that is the urban-rural divide. Because even in Kornetis, all of this is urban resistance, urban protest. We have that. But in the rural areas, I think that's what Sir Michael is trying to kind of address in his question. And I think Papadopoulos consciously tried to address it himself, saying, "Ime protos ergatis." So many of the policies giving electricity is trying to benefit those in the outskirts, in the peripheral areas, who are not part of the civic process, who are not part of the resistors or the protesters in the urban areas. So I think if we're going to do oral history, I think these localized rural individuals are the ones we need to approach, because I do see this division of those in the periphery saying, "Κοιμόμαστε πιο καλά με τη junta. Δεν φοβόμασταν." How do you have this perception of people are being taken to Boulinis and being tortured? So we have two completely different narratives going on. So I think by looking at the outside, the rural type of understanding, I think we're going to have a more comprehensive analysis, and especially for the average person, the social history, which, Sir Michael, you're absolutely right. Social history is a very, very important aspect. I wish we could have, Othan and I wish we could have included it more, as we wish we could have had other chapters, but unfortunately, Berghahn is a little bit limited in its word limit. So,
if you allow me to add something to what you said, I think we also have to look into two factors regarding the reaction to the junta that was quite apathetic in the beginning, at least, especially from the rural areas. First of all, we have to take into account that democracy was quite weak in Europe at that time. I mean, the end of the Second World War was not very far away, and democratization was taking place actually at that time. Not democracy as we know it today was stable and there forever. And the second fact, which is more conspicuously Greek, is that it was the coup happened less than 20 years after the end of the Civil War. So people were really tired of fighting all the time. I mean, if you have to look to resistance, you have to look into World War II, and then what followed after that, it was a massacre. So people didn't really want to get into a new adventure. They didn't believe that something could change. And they were also quite used to having military coups. Military coups where the military went back to the barracks in the past. This time did not happen, but they believed that this was more or less legitimate. It had, you know, the legitimization offered by the regime that existed before that. So I think I have to take these two factors into account when we're looking into people of that time, not trying to project what we think today about the junta, but how they felt about the junta that was coming in. I think this is one of the tasks of historians, to get into the shoes of people that experience those facts. And the second point I would like to make has to do with what Othon asked, said, whether Greece was one of the first countries that entered the end of the Cold War. I think here again, we have two factors that can be advocates of your argument. First of all, that the Metalpolitevsi happened at the culmination of the détente. I mean, the Karamouzi governments adopted the Ostpolitik actually for the Balkans in the 1970s. In 1974, the Helsinki Final Act took place. And the second fact is that at that time, when Greece got out of the military branch of NATO, actually, until 1980, 1974 until 1980, the Balkans in general were not that central in the Cold War. So Greece had the luxury, so to say, to improvise with its domestic priorities. And this is how we can also explain the socialist policies, not only of PASOK after 1988, but also the social mania of the Karamouzi governments of the 1970s, where the emphasis was put on the prosperity of people, and democracy, of course, and not so much on austerity.
If you can add something to what Dina just said, I mean, if you think about it, the big legacy of there is the Turkish threat, but I think with what happens in 74, the whole paradigm shifts towards Turkey. The main preoccupation in the Greek imaginary of the public opinion of the political elites is how to deal with Turkey. There's no Cold War because there is a bigger threat just opposite you, you're supposedly in the same block. That's the great difference. I think one of the things that we as Cold War historians do not discuss as much, that kind of huge turning point, there was already in action, but I think the impetus was just unrelentless in terms of what happened after 74 and how Greece kind of reposition itself, and I think had this huge burden. I mean, if you see all of the negotiation after 74, Turkey is at the epicenter of everything, and it really makes us hard partners because we go on bang about this issue, which is vital for us, but our partners do not seem to share in terms of our anxieties, as you know, why is constitutes the Turkish threat. But there are many questions. I think Lamprini has to kind of sum them up.
Yes. So this is a very interesting discussion, and you can see this from the number of questions that are coming in. So I'll read some of them, and I think that you have to wrap it up and respond to all the questions at once because we only have one round. So to what Richard Eason, if I pronounce it correctly, to what extent do you attribute the rise of terrorist urban guerrilla movements like November 17th to the rule of the colonels? Did the actions of these groups increase the political space for the suppression by the regime? And then Greece was under fascist rule in effect during the German and Italian occupations during World War II. Why did those experiences not discredit forever similar rule, such as that under the colonels? Then another one is from Helen Münster. She asks, could you explain how the Polytechnic event of 1973 occurred? What is the importance of the now obsolete US military seat in Crete? What can liberals now learn from Greece's experience during the junta? And how is the junta taught to Greek school children now? David Blackman, how important was Greece's exclusion from the Council of Europe? Was this part of the background for Greek enthusiasm for joining the EU? Mavros came to Brussels by the beginning of August 74, and he looks forward to reading the book. What was the colonial's policy during Turkey, dominated by the Kypriaco? And then a final one by Andrea Kapetanovic. Could you please comment on the argument that the junta manipulates statistics in order to categorize public as private debt and thus improve the perception of their economic successes? Where does the specific cultural conception of Ελληνοχριστιανισμός promoted by the junta came from? We can see some concepts that blame the two in earlier Greek history, but who was the one who helped put in concrete terms as expressed by the junta? Was anyone from the economic elite punished in Greece for helping or cooperating with the junta? And the final one from Callie Harrison. Does the book look into different foreign politicians and the role in bringing the junta, such as Mr. Kissinger? So I'm afraid we won't have enough time to respond, but you have 2 minutes. So Katerina, do you want to answer, or Othon? I don't know.
Let me try just to give some of them. I mean, the point with the 17th of November is, to my mind, another form of appropriation of a very important, anniversary. Obviously, the Polytechnic was, an event that was very much politicized. The upper hand in this by the left-wing parties in Greece. But most importantly, how the 17th of November terrorist group tried to legitimize its own actions by using some of the things that were particularly dominant, in the Greek understanding, like anti-Americanism, or keeping that kind of division that had its roots in the Civil War. I think that in terms of the other question on the fascist rule and the German occupation, obviously that was particularly significant, and one would have expected that Greece wouldn't like to experiment with those kinds of regimes. But the reality in Greece was very different, because after that there was a civil war that followed. There were big divisions within Greek society, and that's what came to dominate. And we shouldn't forget also that Greece was the first country within the post-Second World War period that experienced the Cold War, that actually inaugurated that kind of division. The first fight between communism and capitalism did take place on the Greek lands. Wow, there are so many other things.
I think we're, yeah, if you have something to respond quickly, because we're running out of time, it's already 8 o'clock. So
one thing I would like to say in the question that how that affected women's rights, I think that's a very interesting question, and that's something that needs to be explored further. We were in a discussion with Kostis Kornetis, we did mention him before. He did actually put this issue that during the Polytechnic, we saw the role of women that was very, very dominant in that type of resistance. And that was a legacy, very important legacy in Greek society that came from this generation of the Polytechnic. And we sometimes overlook, but we definitely need to take this into consideration as well.
thank you, everyone. Thank you for the discussion, and we look forward to reading the book.